My guest today is Nate McCoy, and we are going to be talking about how to navigate the challenges of software development in advertising technology. Nate has been leading engineering teams in AdTech for over 25 years, at aQuantive into its acquisition by Microsoft, and then at AOL into its acquisition by Verizon and merger with Yahoo. As a result, Nate and I have worked together at many different companies. Nate, it is so good to see you. Thank you for taking the time today.
Great to see you too, James. Happy to help.
Excellent. Now, I said you and I go way back. Do you remember where you and I first met for the first time?
Yeah, so I remember an interaction at a Microsoft all hands company meeting that we used to have at Safeco Field in Seattle. I think they've stopped doing them years ago like that. But yeah, and you told me something that I hadn't remembered. Do you remember what you told me about that interaction? What I told you?
I do. I mean, it was so distinctive to me because I'd just been an acquired employee, and you were like the old hand. You'd been there a year or two by this stage. And I will say, disclaimer, I'm sure Microsoft is a different company now. This is 15 years ago. But you were describing to me that the seating arrangements made it clear where you were in the Microsoft hierarchy, that the Windows and Office developers would always be down the front. And you said, look, when we were first acquired, we were right in front of the stage and they were pointing at us and making a big deal about how great we were. And then the next year, we were further back in the first row of seats, not even on the field. And as you were telling this story, we started looking around for our seats, and we were in the nosebleeds, and I kept walking further and further back, and they had wings on the stage, and I had a seat in the third row or third tier, and you could not see the speaker. And given that you just described to me that this showed how important you were at Microsoft, I quickly realized where we were in the Microsoft hierarchy at the time.
Oh, it was so true. And the display advertising world that we were in largely grew up at Microsoft because of MSN, and they had acquired our company back in 2007. So it was a couple of years before they acquired your company, as you said. So I had experienced the whole climbing to the nosebleed section. I don't know if that was the year, but I'll never forget that Balmer always used to do this thing where he would come out and he would run around the floor of the stadium to great cheering and loud music, and it was amusing to watch him because he was like high-fiving and slapping everybody, running down, and he just kept going for a long time, like way past like the cringe moment for me. But I'll never forget that there was this year, and it was at the time where Microsoft was really big into the Windows Phone. I don't know if you remember the Windows Phone. You probably do because they gave it all to us. They gave us all a version. There was a newly acquired company, I don't remember which one, that was sitting in the front row. And as he gets to the front row, he sees a guy filming him on his iPhone. And he grabs the iPhone out of this guy's hands and throws it on the ground and stomps on it. It was like, oh, man. Well, anyway, corporate shenanigans.
Yes, absolutely. I want to get into some of the lessons learned because you have so much experience. But before we even get into that, let's set the stage a little bit. What's different about AdTech? And by that, I mean either when you started 25 years ago, what was it like to build in that environment compared to other environments? And if you want to get into what's different now, we could go there as well.
Well, let's start with like a little context. So at the time, and it was late 1999, I followed a bunch of friends to go work at a startup called Avenue A. And this was just before the dot-com bubble burst. So we were actually, we went public, and we got lucky because it was just months after we went public that the bubble burst. But we had put $120 million in the bank. And so we were able to ride that challenge out. We lost almost all of our customers because most of our customers were, digital, and they were spending money on digital advertising, but then boom, they're gone. So we split into two divisions. The digital agency called Avenue A, focusing at that time on brick and mortar companies to bring them online, and our product group, which was called Atlas. And we renamed the parent entity aQuantive. And I was introduced to this idea that you could pay for a name. I think we paid like $50,000 in consulting for the aQuantive name. And the reason we needed that is that Avenue A was competing with agencies that were all trying to also become digital agencies themselves. And Atlas was selling services to those other agencies. And so we didn't want to have them have to write a check to, you know, anything that had Avenue A anywhere near the contract. So we were Atlas, we were part of aQuantive, and there we were. There was very little AdTech at the time. A DoubleClick was out there already, and they'd been out there for a couple of years. I think that's one of the reasons why our company came into existence, was to compete with them. There was a publisher ad server from Germany, ironically called AdTech, and they ended up getting bought by AOL, I think about 5 years after that. Big publishers like, you know, Yahoo had their own in-house stack, which might just have been a person who was, you know, changing out the HTML manually to put in a new banner ad. The Lumascape didn't exist as far as I knew for AdTech, let alone like it is today, where there's like domains of, you know, Lumascape charts. So the pinnacle of advertising at the time was banner ads running on publisher ad servers, and every publisher was an island. There wasn't any programmatic. There, you know, ad networks were nascent. Google hadn't been released yet. So more, you know, specifically, like, you know, in AdTech, I hadn't worked in sort of large product development groups creating something for the internet before. I had worked solo a lot, or, you know, we would work on things that would be shipped on CD-ROMs or floppy disks even back in the day. So this is different. It's online. It's running 24/7. And we were having to invent everything that we had, as every company at the time was having to invent everything that they had to figure out how to scale reliably. So we went through all of these growth pains about figuring out a software project. Like, how do you plan it? How do you code it? How do you test it? Because you're not spending a year doing that. You have to do it continuously, constantly getting pushed. You got to release. But all of us engineers, we only knew how to do what were called waterfall projects that you plan up front and then you work on for a long period of time and then you release. So shifting that mindset internally was a lot of what we did. We didn't use open source. And I don't know how much of your audience is sort of familiar with the open source world, but it did exist back then, but we didn't trust it to run, you know, our $100 million business, couple $100 million business. We even internally were saying, like, we can't really rely on it, right? And so that was not something that we did. We were very, very operationally intense. I remember talking to one of our founders of aQuantive, a guy named Mike Galgon, and in a one-on-one, and he was pushing me as leading the engineering team at the time on the operational staff. We were something like 2 software engineers for every 1 sort of person running it in production, 2 to 1. The cost of that was enormous, and it was eating into our margin dramatically. And he was saying, like, this has to change. At that time, and this is like the early aughts, I didn't yet have the vision for how that would change, but eventually we get there when we fast forward.
So 2 to 1, for those who aren't sort of familiar with usual ratios, what would be a ratio now that would be acceptable of sort of developers to operations?
I think an unacceptable ratio now is 10 to 1. But I would say in most of the years that I was at Yahoo, AOL, we were operating in roughly 10 to 12 to 1. I don't accept it. I would be pushing on that. I think there were times at Microsoft where we were, as software engineers, basically, in some sense, almost had 0, where we really pushed all of the operations to the developers. Now, most companies have pulled back from that. There is some specialization that is useful. But now, in this day and age, if you're operating a system that is scaled in production, you're also a software engineer. You're writing code to sort of operate it and do all the tooling that is necessary for that. But it's a very much smaller group, and all the people that are writing the software, they sort of rely on this tooling to exist, but they can change it too. So I would say, you know, something, you know, higher than 10 or 12 to 1, maybe 20 something, that could be good. 5% of your staff focused explicitly on the production environment.
Talk to me about the fact that when you were at aQuantive, it sounds like you had to be more agile, even though that may not have even been the term at the time, and not focused on these big waterfalls. Were you ahead of the curve, or did you have to go back to waterfalls? Because I remember 2008 through 2010, Microsoft was still doing these massive waterfalls, a 6-month long release cycle. And even when I moved over to Yahoo, it would have been 5 years later than that before Yahoo really embraced Agile. It had been also very much on the sort of large waterfall. And as you know, there's a lot of risks associated with that, because you've got the whole industry could have moved on in that 6-month window, and you can be releasing something that is in a sense almost no longer relevant. So talk to me about that transition, especially as you came in from a company that it sounds like you were actually ahead of the curve there for a while.
In some sense, this is the story of my career. And it would actually shock me, if knowing you and how your mind works, if you and I didn't talk about this a lot in the Microsoft days, because you saw what was going on, and we developed a rapport. So, and I had opinions. So around about 2003, like we created our product Atlas, right? It was great. We did this Death March project. We focused. We got it out the door. We called it a Death March, but it was one of the most memorable experiences we ever had. And then 9/11 happened just when we were going to start to sell it. And so we didn't sell it to anybody. In fact, our stock like plummeted to like 70 cents, and from like $60-70, right? And we laid off like a lot of our engineering staff. We were down to something like 25 people. But we were still sort of operating in this waterfall plan, release and deploy over many, many months, 6 months. And people would say, well, you got to get it down to 3 months instead of 6 months. And we would say, but the planning phase takes 2 months and the testing phase takes 2 months. We can't do it. So one of the guys that I worked with, that I wish it was me, he was the visionary. I was like the second, it always takes that first person who's like, breaking it open, but you need that second follower to like really like get everyone else to come along. And I feel like I was kind of like that second.
Who was the visionary?
Ken Horn was his name. And he saw this Agile software development model of essentially doing it in month-long sprints, they called it. And which is all this terminology has leaked its way into, a lot of different domains now. But I saw it and I was like, that's the solution. So he was doing it in one little team, and I was trying to take it to like a much larger team. And management was resistant actually to changing, even though they wanted us to go faster. But we got them to engage and said, like, it can't be worse. So we started doing it. We were really by the book on Agile for a long period of time. One of the things we quickly noticed was that the software testing piece of the problem was taking like past our sprint boundary. Like we would be ready for them to start testing at the end of the month. They didn't have any time to test, and it was always kind of a crappy experience. So we just said, you know what? There are models that talk about not even having testers, that you have software developers testing your own code. And we said, why don't we go to that? So the software testers that could write code, they became developers. The ones that couldn't, they left the company. And so we then became just a development only shop, and we wrote our own tests, and nothing went wrong. Everything just kind of worked. And we were like, it wasn't any worse for sure. And it got better. We were more, quote, agile. By the way, just tangent or related, but I really despise the word agile now because it's been used so much that it is now burnt for me. Like the practices of being, continuous and small batch and minimizing risk and all of that, I'm 100% for, but I just don't really use the term agile anymore. So we got to Microsoft, and yeah, you're right. I mean, they were the company that was most well known for shipping on floppy disks and CD-ROM, and they just did not have the mindset of the engineering product development teams at Microsoft. About a third of the people were software developer engineers in the discipline of test. And that was true when we got there in 2007. By the time I left in 2015, there was no one in the discipline of software developer, engineer, and test at Microsoft. But it took like battle after battle after battle after battle to get them there. I remember the delivery engine for Bing had this one terrible release where it was this giant, complicated, scaled system. And it took them 6 months to write the code. It took them 3 months to just integrate all the various pieces that needed to come together for the deployment. That was nights and weekends. That was just like intense scrutiny And it finally convinced them that we have to just do something different in the Bing and the advertising technology teams. We were ahead of the curve at Microsoft. I got pulled in to go talk to Bing search team, 2,000 people. Like I got in front of, it made me nervous. I got up in front of like a whole bunch of engineers and said, it's okay, you can do this. You don't have to have testers. And eventually the company changed and it went its way. I think there definitely was still testers when I got to AOL in 2015. I had a larger role and responsibility. I was able to help them move away from having this tester. It's not that testers are bad. Most of them became software engineers on our team. It's the phase, it's the mindset. It's like this extra communication. And, you can write code to test code and it's still code, and that's fun. So anyway, yeah, I've watched this transition to just continuous delivery and continuous deployment over the last 25 years.
And why is it a battle? Because the way you describe this is like a war. And I think it's a little odds where I have seen good engineers are very pragmatic, and if they see a better tool, they'll jump on that tool, whether the tool is a software tool, a better programming language, and they want to be on the cutting edge. So given that you had established a model that worked, presumably at aQuantive, that was more around continuous delivery, you had something that worked. Why do you feel like it was so many battles to break the status quo around waterfall development?
Well, think of Microsoft in 2007. I mean, under the years from like 2000 until Balmer left, they were still writing decades of massive success with the model of waterfall projects, right? So why would they think any different? Like we are the biggest company on the planet, or one of the biggest companies on the planet. Our way works. We haven't really seen demonstrated success. They hadn't felt the pain of Google eating their lunch really. And all of these internet companies that, even though they got, quote, internet religion maybe in the mid 90s, and when they started coming out with the Internet Explorer browser, they just didn't really buy it all internally. And if you have like corporate vice presidents managing a team of 20,000 people at Microsoft that are all testers. Actually, they didn't have a single test at corporate vice president, but you might have like a person who has 1,000 software developer engineers and tests working on Office. You want to protect your job, you're doing it the right way. And by the way, Office was not live then; it was still shipped, and so that is the model in order to safely deliver that CD-ROM that somebody plugs in and installs Office. So me coming in and just saying, hey, this really works for us, they just didn't have any reason to believe it or care. And like you said, the display advertising team had already moved up to the third bleacher, seats. They didn't really respect it. But when problems as an online system, Bing ads, our display advertising, when they ran into like this problem of trying to get the delivery engine for Bing ads, which is already making $1 billion, I think at that time, to deploy after 6 months with no changes, and they couldn't, they said, I guess we do need to try something different. And so people did. But I remember having conversations with the head of testing for advertising and he was a senior to me. He was a peer of my boss, saying like, look, you could minimize risk if you make tiny little changes that you can quickly roll back from continuously, rather than doing a very big change that if you mess it up, you're going to lose $1 million an hour. His argument was exactly the opposite. The risk is if you continually deploy, because that's when you're going to have a problem. You need to really test the crap out of it and have it like all your ducks in a row and then deploy it all at once. So just the fact that every company on the planet had figured out how to do this, and Microsoft and probably many others hadn't, but they were seeing all this success that eventually, and they were feeling the pain of trying to be online. They finally just, changed and just said like, look, we're gonna adopt this. And then they actually made, like, watching them make the transition to eliminate the role, I was like kind of shocked. I didn't know that it would happen, but they did change, and they're 100% like, they're cloud-based and all of that now. That reminds me of things that we didn't have back in the beginning. We didn't have cloud. Like, we just had our own machines and we rented space in data centers. That's a huge change as well, because everything if it's not already, it's going cloud for many companies, most ad tech.
Let's stay on the components of the ad stack, and I'm not going to articulate all the various components of an ad stack, but for those who haven't really thought it through, I want to give a sense for how complex it is. And you have all these different things that have to work together. You have an ad delivery engine. You have to have creative review of the advertising assets. Potentially, you have to have inventory forecasting, an analytics layer, a targeting layer. Now you would have to have in programmatic an auction layer to clear all of your inventory. From your perspective, what is the most difficult thing about delivering an advertising platform?
Difficult thing about delivering an advertising platform. It is incredibly complex technology that's operating in an ecosystem. It operates in a much different way than, say, a publisher serving a web page, a bunch of content that is deployed and images that are deployed. A request comes in, a whole bunch of things come out. But they happen at a different scale with advertising and header bidding now and all of those things. We're running many auctions between a supplier of advertising like an SSP and a buyer of advertising like a DSP for every ad slot. And it all has to happen in under a couple hundred milliseconds. 200-300 milliseconds is max. So, I mean, that is just inherently scaled and complex. We're running up to, many hundreds of billions of auctions a day at Yahoo. And our biggest competitor was claiming 1 trillion auctions, although we were always kind of skeptical because, we thought we saw all the inventory on the internet anyway. But regardless of that, very, very complicated. Now you're also representing many tens of millions, even billions over the whole year of dollars of spend. And all of that has to be chosen to make a bid and prioritized at runtime and extremely fast. This bidding process and the optimization of it and the targeting of it, that's a PhD research scientist level problem that it takes experimentation. It takes working with the engineers to run those experiments and then interpret those experiments and then have many experiments running simultaneously. So every advertising platform is a research experimentation platform of any scale that exists in this day and age. And then even just the complexity of working with research engineers who don't necessarily understand technology scale. Like they understand the science of it and they understand the analytics of it, but in order to be able to actually code it and run it, you have to have very deep engineers as well who can interface with that PhD scientist and write this code. But it goes like beyond that. I mean, there's so many challenges of serving an advertising stack. If you represent that you have bought and delivered an ad, but you have discrepancies with a tracking system that your customer might be using, whether you're on the supply side or the demand side, those investigations into why their numbers don't match up with your numbers, they can sometimes take teams of people months at a very large organization to figure out the analytics, to figure out what was changing, to figure out what's going on. I mean, there's thing after thing after thing that makes delivering an advertising technology stack very, very complicated. And also, for the right mindset, super interesting.
100%. And as you're talking through the discrepancy issue, I know how disruptive, distracting that is to the engineering team, because I was often the business person caught in between the client yelling about the discrepancies and the need for actually resolution. I know you hadn't wanted to necessarily get into AI today, but you've given me the question that I need to follow on. So you reference the large number of data scientists and researchers that have already been in this industry for decades. So when people ask me about the impact of AI, I take the position that there are components that are ripe for AI to jump in. But when they talk about the targeting and segmentation and delivery engines, I do see incremental value from AI, but I believe that there's been so much machine learning already deployed over the past few years, particularly at the biggest companies, at the Metas, at the Googles, etc., that we won't see real revolution in that part of the stack in the near future. So I'd actually love your perspective, because as you can tell, I've taken a position, but you're actually a lot closer to this than I am.
Well, I've been close to it since I was a child, reading science fiction and watching Star Trek. I've been into the idea of AI like forever before it even really existed, and I've watched over this time, and it's grown in fits and starts. So prior to ChatGPT, blowing up the world a couple of years ago, um, artificial intelligence really was kind of focused in this area that you mentioned, machine learning, which is really taking very large sets of data and using that to basically figure out how to predict what's going to happen. Like if this thing happens this way and that thing happens that way, and we have the data and we can do the analysis, we can create a model that we can actually reference in a delivery engine to say, what is the most likely outcome right now? And we can put a score on it based off of these machine learning exercises. Google and Facebook are enormous because their machine learning was on point. Like they did a really good job with it. There's a lot of other reasons, but they put a big focus into it. And every stack that I've worked on since the early aughts has had a focus on machine learning with researchers to get there. So before the current set of what we call AI, that was really the whole world. It might be doing things like image recognition. There was beginnings of work with speech recognition, and prediction things like prediction models, not just for advertising, but people are familiar with having Netflix give them a recommendation of what to watch, and that's been happening for years, and that is and was what AI was called. Now, I think what has happened to the word AI is kind of like, to me, almost like what has happened to the word meme. Because when meme first came out on the internet, it really referred to a viral concept. Just something, it was a conceptual term. Now, meme basically means those images with words on them. People make a meme. They're making memes all the time. It has changed in its meaning. So the meme of meme is now different. AI has gone through this transition as well, because I think if you just poke a person on the street, you would get, if you ask them what AI is, they would think ChatGPT, right? So we can claim victory that we've been doing AI for decades, but in some sense, that has sailed. It's going to happen, but people, when they say AI, I think they're thinking about ChatGPT and all the amazing things that are happening with that. But to your point about the innovation in machine learning, that will keep going and is relevant to advertising stacks. But the current version of AI is not relevant to digital ad serving yet, right? Although I think that there are ways that it's possible that you could train a large language model on all of the transaction data that happens in advertising, and maybe there's something that could be had from that. That's an area that is unexplored, but it would be very costly to do. It could cost you a lot of money to do, but I don't really right now see it happening. And we all experience working with these things. Like they're all knowledgeable idiots. Like they know everything, but they come back with things that are just like, oh, we got to change that. We got to change that. This is better. You're going in the right direction. You're saving me some time, but I am spending a lot of time guiding you, right? So the hallucinations are also there. They confidently assert something that is just not true. And so that version of AI, not directly applicable to the optimization problem of advertising, but every sort of thing that surrounds it. Yeah, sure. Like I'm a software engineer and I need a test for the code that I just wrote. Ask the AI to just write that test. I'll change it a little bit, but the test will work. And if I'm writing a document and I, want some feedback or even an initial version, and I need to, create a requirements document, my thoughts are unordered. The AI creates one. I say, oh, I can change that. Here's how it should be. All of that stuff helps make everything surrounding the advertising technology go faster. First versions of things, commentary on what you're doing. But yeah, AI is not that exact. It's not directly applicable yet to the serving. But I do think in the future, there are some interesting things that will happen. Like, for example, and this is just me, but I kind of got this from a science fiction book, but this is well before ChatGPT became viable. And just parenthetically, I had despaired that we would ever see something like ChatGPT because I've been following AI research for years and it just kept making incremental progress. But sure, we can recognize cats and photos now, but the idea of something that you could talk to that gives an intelligible response that's useful, I didn't know if we would see this for another 10 or 20 years. And so, the fact that it's happened has opened up my science fiction brain again. So So I'm imagining a future where AI agents are really useful. ChatGPT 4.5 just came out, and it has deep research. I am working on a software project right now that's kind of advanced, and I asked it to go figure out a problem that I needed to solve. And you can watch like the text of what it's trying to do as it's doing it. It was going out and looking at websites. It was saying, this looks like it could be useful, but maybe not. It spent 5 minutes on that, 5 whole minutes of GPU time at the expensive data centers, and it came back with a document that was annotated with links to source materials that pretty much answered my question, and I could see is directionally accurate, and I thought, wow, that is amazing, and I might even pay $200 a month for that, which is what OpenAI is charging for it, but. So we'll see. I don't know how often I have that kind of research question, but I think in the future, this will become just like standard. It'll be part of what we do every day. I think in the future, we'll have AI agents that act on our behalf for many things. Find all of the trip options that I want to take, give those options to me, summarize, let me book that trip, go book that trip as my agent, and it will reliably do it. I think we'll have an AI agent that receives all of the marketing and advertising and acts as an in-between layer. I think advertising will be advertising to my AI agent. I will still trade my eyeballs and my attention for free content, but it's going to let through what is more interesting to me, which also benefits the advertisers in the first place. But I think there's going to be a lot of digital advertising that happens to AIs that I never see that it will let through when it's useful. And I think that is a world that will eventually come.
I actually connected with a former Wrapped colleague yesterday, and we, as you would expect, got into AI. And he was reminding me that back in 2006, 2007, we used to have a button on some of the Wrapped things that was optimize. And it was, in some sense, just conceptual. But we got feedback that people didn't actually want to have a machine optimize their campaign. They wanted to have the control. And so we were actually discussing the mindset change that has occurred over that period of time as we've all got increasingly comfortable with the fact that we don't have to control every aspect of campaign delivery. And I think that train is going to continue.
That's going to continue.
Yeah. Hey, I got to ask you about all of the time that you spent on integrations and transition of one software version to another, particularly given all the different companies that you worked in. I expect you have strong positions, so I'm going to leave the question very open-ended to just say, what do you have to say about doing integrations?
Well, my strong opinion,
don't do them.
Well, that was what my answer was. First off, don't do them. That is the number one answer. When I joined AOL, it was just before Satya Nadella became CEO at Microsoft, and I was basically done with Microsoft, and it just wasn't really the right environment for me. I think it's probably better now, but at the time, I met a bunch of people from AOL because we were outsourcing our display technology to AOL. And they all seemed like the people that I used to work with in the early days at aQuantive. They had each other's backs. They weren't sort of like fighting each other for territory. They were fun to have a drink with. There was like a lot of good things going on. So I joined in 2015. Not long after that, well, right then, Verizon was buying AOL. Not long after that, Verizon bought Yahoo. They brought us together, and I counted 14 distinct advertising technology stacks in play across Yahoo AOL at the time. And I very much lived out the retiring of most of those stacks in my career at Yahoo. And looking back on it, I would say that there are a couple of things. First off, when I say don't do them, I mean, I think it actually goes back to a more fundamental piece. If you want to have these technologies or these people, these engineers, pick one. Right? Don't try to merge them together. Just pick one and take all of the engineers and put them on the one that you want to go with, and then just have them change it to make it like work the way that you want. Because bringing them together sacrifices so much opportunity cost, time, and when you pick one that you want to like make better, you're going to lose something, and you're going to have some revenue breakage. Probably lose some customers from whichever system that you're shutting down. Accept it, because that means you're going to have that time back to now build the features that are going to get you the revenue that you want. We did it worst of all ways in some of the big migrations that we did. Like we migrated the SSPs that we had onto one stack and moved about $1 billion of business from one system to another. And we really killed ourselves doing it, nights and weekends. I was up on a Saturday night asking, trying to troubleshoot issues with the migration, because the directive from the leadership needing to, they needed to solve their own business problems. I get it, but they said you cannot lose any money. There could be no revenue breakage. And with that, the project took much longer than it needed to. We probably cut corners that we, shouldn't have, and we made a Frankenstein's monster that kind of put us behind in terms of competing with other companies for years. And I don't think Yahoo has fully ever even recovered from all the migrations that they've done. So this existed at Microsoft as well, just integrating into your stack. I don't know. To me, it's a fool's game. I would say pick your thing, invest in your thing. If you have those engineers or a product that comes in, if it's a better product, switch to it and abandon yours. Don't, it's the sunk cost fallacy. Don't believe you just have to keep it because you've already spent money on it, right? Determine your future and go after it. And it actually feeds into to me, what the most difficult thing really for advertising technology development, which I think is something you wanted to talk about, is totally related, which is focus, right? And I don't think this is limited to just digital advertising technology. I just have witnessed it in, the 25 years I've spent in it, right? In some sense, this is cynical or, I don't know, funny or amusing. Let's have fewer product managers. That might be the solution, because every senior product manager that you have, they need to advance their career. They need to have a win, right? So if you got to, if they all need to be doing something, well, you're going to try to do all those things. You're going to say, yes, each of them has their own thing that is more important than everyone else's, but they have just one engineering team that they got to come to solve their problems. Or you can allocate engineering teams to all of them, but they're all going to be, time sliced. They're all going to be working on their own small, bad, minuscule thing. Pick a big thing. Do it really well. No one really cares if you have a bunch of features if the most important feature doesn't work as great as it should. If it's not easy to use and doesn't make you money, right, then you're failing. So pick a few small things or big things, focus on getting them done, and reap the rewards of that. Focus, focus, focus. Number one problem to delivering an advertising platform, probably the number one problem in engineering, everywhere, is being able to focus on what you need to get done.
I didn't think we'd end up as the solution being less product managers, but I love the candor.
By the way, just no shade on product managers. I love product managers. They're great to work with, but it seems like every place that I've worked, I've just seen we have so many constituencies with so many giant needs, right? And the greatest successes in my career came from when we said, we're doing one thing. Even though I didn't like doing that migration, the $1 billion migration I talked about, we really focused on doing that. And we were successful. We didn't have revenue breakage, right? I got a promotion out of it. But so good for me.
Thank you for sharing the stories. And as we have just a little bit of time left, are there any other stories that spring to mind? And then the amount of time you've spent in this industry, everybody seems to have one. You wouldn't believe this kind of story. Have you any spring to mind for you?
I don't think mine is so much you wouldn't believe it. I feel like I have a lot of stories, but they often come down to sort of the revenue breakage. I feel like that's more like a negative story. Management made a bad call. We should have allowed revenue breakage. And, that's not so amusing. But I do remember being really struck by something when I first got into the industry. Avenue A at the time, they had hired a CEO. The founders realized that being CEO wasn't their skill. So they hired one from ABC Sports, a guy named Brian McAndrews, and he was great. Really good operational guy. He didn't need to be in the limelight. He was really good at letting excellent people do excellent work. He just was good on making sure accountability was lined up. Everyone knew who was responsible for what. And I thought that was great. One of the very first meetings that pulled in directors, and I was a director at the time, directors and above, that we had when he joined the company, it was about 100 of us sitting around, we spent hours on debating whether advertising on the internet was digital or online. the great online versus digital debate. And it just amused me more than anything else is that we were spending all of this time. As an engineer, I was clear. Back in 1982, when I bought a dot matrix printer, I had to call my electrical engineering friend to figure out how it worked. And he said, is there a button on that says online? I said, yeah. He said, well, press that button. I pressed it, and all of a sudden it started printing. I was like, online. I don't know what online means. All right, but now I knew what it meant. And then America Online was big in the 90s, right? And so we're, now January 2000. What are we? Are we online or digital? I'm clearly digital because online is for old people. So anyway, that was funny to me how expensive that meeting was to figure out if we were digital or online.
I've been in similar meetings that have been a lot of navel gazing. Nate, this has been so much fun. As we come to the end of our time, have you got any closing thoughts? And what's the best way for people to find you if they're interested in tracking your work?
Well, I got to update it because I don't work at Yahoo anymore. I'm semi-retired. So LinkedIn is probably the best. I've boycotted Facebook for years because of all the death and political morality issues. But I am definitely on LinkedIn, and I link to things that I do there. Check out my YouTube channel. It's called Nate Piano, and I have published some classical music there that I played, a lot of it during the COVID. So it's been a little while. I am
a subscriber to your yes.
Subscribe, and I just wrote a song actually, so I'm gonna record it and put it out there soon. I've started working on a project that is completely different than anything I've ever worked on, but it kind of fits with my I don't know, science fiction, fantasy, visualization, digital art mindset. As a musician, as a piano player, I love like digital technology and the intersection of audio and visual and creativity. So I'm starting a business that I'm calling Hana, which is the Japanese word for flower. It's great because it's 4 letters and easy to say and remember. But the idea is that almost all of the creative tools that exist, whether they're video editing software or audio editing software or CAD tools or 3D animation, they all require subject matter experts, and they're difficult to learn. You got to, read manuals, and you got to watch YouTube videos to even touch the surface. But then I look at something like Minecraft, and kids are making these amazing like architectural wonders, and even adults are making them, collaborating, working in real time, and everything is straightforward. Like you can tell what you need to do. And I've had the thought that what if you made creative software that was like a video game? So all the choices are easy to do. They generally have good results. It's fun. You could work on it with your friends. And I'm thinking that what I'm envisioning would be something that could scale from something into your living room to something that you could be running on stage with like a concert, to something that would be, useful for all the visuals at a club or a rave, or in a lobby in Las Vegas or Dubai, or running the Sphere in Las Vegas. But all tools that you would make, in a game like a fun environment. So Hana, watch for that.
I wonder how many people are going to reach out to you to collaborate on that now. And it sounds very exciting relative to the bowels of AdTech that you and I have spent time in. Hey, Nate, thank you so much. Hope you have a good rest of your day and really appreciate the time.
Absolutely, James. Take care.